Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to discuss about user-defined exceptions. That means how to create our own exceptions. So in the previous videos, we have seen about predefined exceptions like arithmetic, array, index, outer boundaries, IO exceptions. But now, if we have a situation there we are getting an exception which is not existing, then in that case, we can go with a user-defined exception. So, for example, consider I'm designing a box. So, for that box, we have some different measurements like length, width, and breadth. So, all these values should be positive values. If the user enters any of these values as 0 or negative value, so obviously I should throw an exception. So, for this, we don't have any a predefined exception to indicate the situation. In that case, we can create our own exception to explain about this scenario. So there you can handle that exception also. So we don't have any predefined exceptions to match the situation. So first you need to create that exception. Then after that you need to handle that exception also. So we'll see how to create a user-defined exceptions. Right. So we can create our own exceptions. To create any user-defined exception, you need to extend the properties of the predefined exception classes. We have so many exceptions here, like IO exception, arithmetic exception, a superclass exception class, array index outer boundaries, file not found, runtime exception. Like this, we have so many exceptions. If you extend any of these class properties, then your class will become an exception class. But now, before extending the properties, first you need to know which type of exception you want to create. That means whether you want to create a checked exception or whether you want to create an unchecked exception. So already in the previous video, we have discussed about the checked and unchecked exceptions. So what is meant by unchecked exceptions? The exceptions which are not checked by the compiler is called as unchecked exceptions. And which exceptions comes under unchecked exceptions? All the subclasses of runtime exceptions are comes under unchecked exception. What are the different examples we have, like arithmetic exception, array index, out of boundaries exception, file not found exception. So all these exceptions comes under runtime exception, which comes under unchecked exception. So if you want to create unchecked exception, then you need to extend any of these class properties. So what are these classes? Runtime exception or arithmetic exception or array index out of boundaries exception or file not found exception. Like this, we have so many unchecked exception. So if you extend any of these properties, then your class will become an unchecked exception. No, I want to create a checked exception. So what does mean by checked exception? The exceptions which are checked by the compiler. So at the time of compile time itself, it will check for the exceptions. Those exceptions are called as checked exceptions. And which exceptions comes under checked exception? All the subclasses of exception class except runtime exception are called as checked exception. So what are the different exceptions we have? Like IO exceptions we have, interrupted exception we have. So all these comes under checked exceptions. Then if you extend any of these properties, any of these in the sense, you can extend the properties of IO exception, you can extend the properties of interrupted exception, or you can extend the properties of exception class also. Even if you extend the properties of exception class, your class will become a checked exception. So here your wish, if you want to create checked exception, you need to create like you can extend the properties of any of the predefined checked exception. If you want to create unchecked exception, then you can extend any of those properties. So if you are creating an unchecked exception, so no need to handle that, no need to handle that. So same thing, yeah, the system will take care of that. If you are creating a checked exception, then you need to handle that exception using throws keyword or using try catch. Otherwise, you will get the compile time error. So these are the different syntaxes to create our own exception. See, class A exception is our exception, which is extending the properties of exception. So this A exception will be considered as checked exception. Why? Because exception is the superclass here. So exception comes under checked exception. So A exception is also comes under checked exception only. Next, class B exception, you are extending the properties of IO exception. IO exception is also checked exception. So if you are extending the properties of checked exception, your class will also become a checked exception. Then if I want to create unchecked exception, then you need to extend the properties of any of the unchecked exception. What are the unchecked exceptions we have? You can extend the properties of runtime exception, array index out of boundary exception, arithmetic exception, index out of bounds exception. So these are all different unchecked exception. If you extend any of these class properties, your classes will become unchecked exceptions. Now we'll see one program. So same example previously we have discussed, right? So we are creating a box here. So with three values, that is length, width and height. Now, first you need to create your own exception class. So class invalid box exception. So this is your exception name. You can give any name for your exception class, which is extending the properties of runtime exception, which is extending the properties of runtime exception. So if you're writing runtime exception in the sense, it comes under unchecked exception. Then within this, what we are doing, we are not doing anything. Simply we are writing a constructor. That's it. So within this class, I'm just writing a constructor. So what is the constructor name? It should be same as your class name. That is invalid box exception. And here I'm writing parameterized constructor. So this parameter should be passed by the caller. So whenever you're creating object for this class, you need to pass some message. What is the message you are passing? Just information about your exception. So that message I'm passing as an argument. So that's why I'm writing a parameterized constructor here. So what is the parameter here? String. So what is this string? A description about your exception. So what I'm doing here I have a superclass. What is a superclass? Runtime exception. So what we need to do, I'm just calling the superclass constructor. So this is a runtime exception is a predefined class. In this predefined class, we have a parameterized constructor. What is that parameter? Again, string only. So whenever you have a parameterized constructor in the superclass, you need to call that constructor specifically using super keyword. So I'm calling the superclass constructor using super keyword, but it is a parameterized constructor which is expecting a string argument. So what is that string argument I'm passing here? Same message, whatever I'm getting from the user, that message I'm passing to the superclass. So this will be the first statement. Within this constructor, this should be the first statement. And after that, you can write your own statements. Along with that superclass message, you're printing your own message. What is your message? An attempt is made to create an invalid box object. So when the control will come to this constructor, whenever you're trying to create an invalid box in the sense invalid measurements. With the invalid measurements, if you're trying to create a box, then it will raise this exception. So at that time, what is the message you're printing? An attempt is made to create an invalid box object. So this message is your wish. You can write any message related to your exception. That's it. So this is your exception class. I'm closing my exception class. So class, your exception name, you can write any exception name which extends the properties of any of the predefined exception, But here I'm writing runtime exception. That means you're creating an unchecked exception. So within this, I'm writing a parameterized constructor. Within that constructor, we need to call the superclass constructor, followed by you can print any of your own message. Now I'm writing the exact program. So this is the actual class where we are going to generate the exception. So here I'm going to create a box with three measurements, length, width and height. So to read these values, we are writing a constructor here, box. So with these three values, double L, double W, double H. So L indicates length, W indicates width and H indicates height. So now I'm just checking the condition. So when I can create this exception whenever any of these values are equal to 0 or less than 0. So that means if you enter any invalid value like 0 or negative value, then I need to create and throw that exception. So I'm just checking if L is less than or equal to 0, or W is less than or equal to 0, or H is less than or equal to 0. Or in the sense, if any of these three values are less than or equal to 0, I can create the exception. So how to create the exception? I mean, for which class we need to create the exception? We don't have any predefined exception for this, right? So we have created our own exception class. What is that? Invalid box exception. So for that, what I'm doing, I'm creating an object. So instead of creating an object with a traditional syntax, what I'm doing here, new, this object creation, new, followed by the class name. What is the class name? Invalid box exception. So within that, see, this is a constructor. After you, whatever you're writing, that is nothing but a call to the constructor. So what is the constructor we have in invalid box exception? A parameterized constructor which is expecting a string message. So now I'm passing that string message. What is the string message? Invalid box object creation. So this is your wish. You can pass any message which is related to your exception. Now, after creating this exception object, what I need to do, I need to throw this exception. I need to throw this exception. Why you need to throw? So, like if you are handling this exception using try catch, anyhow, from try to catch, you need to throw the exception. I already told you that if it is a user defined exception, you need to throw that using throw keyword. See, here we are using throw keyword. What is the syntax for throw? Throw followed by the object, which type of exception you're getting. So this is the object. So what I'm doing, instead of creating a separate object, here only I'm creating object and I'm throwing that. But here I'm not writing that try catch keyword. Try catch keyword I'm not writing. So instead of writing try catch, we have another way. What is that? You can throw that. You can throw that using throws keyword. If you write like this, what happens? The system will take care of your exception, right? So throws, what type of exception you're getting? Invalid box exception. Throws invalid box exception. This is one way of throwing your exception. Otherwise, you can handle your exception using try catch block. So even if you use try catch, you need to throw it from try to catch. Even if you throw the exception to the system handler, you need to throw it using throw keyword, right? So whenever you write the statement, the exception will be thrown to the system handler. It will take care of that. So if this condition is true, you're creating object and you're throwing them. Otherwise, you can simply assign the values. L value will be assigned to length, W will be assigned to width, H will be assigned to height. So this is a normal process of your program. This is one way. But we are creating an unchecked exception. As we know, if it is an unchecked exception, no need to throw that, no need to handle that. So that's your wish. Even if you write, it doesn't care about it. See, optional as invalid box exception is unchecked. If it is unchecked, it is optional. It's not mandatory. So why? Because it is not checked by the compiler. So this is the remaining program. So here I'm writing different methods: get length, get width, get height, area, and value. So if your values are positive values, then like normal values, then all these functions will be executed. So in the main function, I'm trying to create two objects here. B1 with three zeros. So whenever you enter zero values for length, width, and breadth, obviously you will get that exception. So it cannot create a like, of course, it will raise the exception and B2 will be created in normal fashion, right? And then area of B2 you are printing. Why? Because B2 is a normal object, you can print the area of the object. So in this program, what we are doing, we are using throws keyword. Using throws, you are informing the system to handle that exception. But what is that exception? Invalid box exception. So system doesn't know what is meant by invalid box exception. That's why what we are doing, whenever you get the exception, at that time only you are throwing that object. If you throw that object, it can know what type of exception it is by seeing your constructor or by seeing your class. So try to execute this. Before execution, we have another process. What is that other process? Using try catch. So one is using throws keyword and the other one is using try catch. So this is try catch. So within main function, there we are getting exception whenever you create an object. So whenever you create an object, there may be a chance to get an exception. That's why I'm writing the statement within try block, within try block. So if these statements are outside try block, right? So that means like for each try, you can write a catch block here. So try followed by catch and try followed by catch. But you cannot write multiple tries here. Multiple tries is not possible, right? Of course, it's not multiple try. Try followed by catch and try followed by catch. This is okay. This is okay, right? So now we have these two facilities. You can follow any of these two. You can simply throw the exception to the system handler using throws keyword, or you can handle them using try catch. But as it is an unchecked exception, these two are not mandatory. Any of these two processes are not mandatory. You can simply leave them. You can simply leave by throwing that exception. Okay, so we'll try to execute this. Simply copy this code. So exception test one is our class name. We'll try to save this. Exception test one dot jar. Now if I try to execute this, exception test one dot jar. So we got some errors. Maybe by copying we got this errors. So I'm just saving this. So there are no errors. Now if I try to execute this, so an attempt is made to create an invalid box object. Why? Because we are creating a box B1 with all three zeros. So exception in thread main invalid box exception. So at 34 line we got this exception. But here what happens at box B1 itself we are getting the exception. So the control will go to directly to the handler by skipping all the remaining statements. See, so at this point itself, we are getting exception. So the next statements will not be executed. So here what we are doing, we can write a throw statement, right? So this is, we are not handling anything by because it is an unchecked exception. We are not throwing this. We are not handling using try catch. So we can throw this. That means in this method, you may get this exception. That's why what I'm writing throws invalid box. Wait a minute. The class name should be same as this one. So invalid box exception. So throws invalid box exception. So this is one way. This is one way. Of course, it is an unchecked exception, so it's not mandatory to write. So I'm simply showing the execution to you. So no change in the output, even if you write that. And the other one, you can create, you can write try catch block. So try for the statement, the first one, followed by catch. For this catch, invalid box object. Then you can print that system.out.println e dot to string. Then you're closing catch. Then again I'm opening one more try. Within this, I'm creating the next statement. The next statement, then followed by catch. Again catch. So same catch you can write here. So I'm just saving this program. Then if I try to execute this, so no errors. Now here if you observe, the first object, for this object you're getting an error message. That means an attempt is made to create an invalid box object. See, we are getting our own message. Why? Because in the previous execution, the system handled our exception. So we got the system generated message. But now I'm getting my own message. In the constructor, we have printed one message, right? What is that message? An attempt is made to create an invalid box object. Why? Because you're handling using try catch. That means you're handling in your own way. But that's why you're getting your own message. But in the previous execution, we have seen we are simply informing the handler to take care of that using throws keyword. That's why we got system generated message. This is for first box. And coming to second box we are getting the area. For the second box we are getting the area. Why? Because now you are maintaining two different try blocks. So for the first try you got the exception and that is handled by catch block. And for the second try you didn't get any exception, so it executed in the normal fashion. So you're maintaining two different try blocks. That's why you are able to get the second object also. For example, if I try to maintain only one try now, so we'll see. So if I remove the second try, so second try and second catch, what we will do, we will place these statements. We will place these statements within first try only. First try only. So what happens here? Whenever you get the exception at B1 statement, automatically the control will go to catch and B2 will not be created. So we don't get the B2 output. Now we'll see if I execute this. See, I'm not getting the area. So previously we got the area of B2, but now I'm not getting area of B2. Why? Because at box B1 itself, we got the error, right? That's why exception. That's why we are not moving to B2. And one more thing, I just want to explain about throw keyword here. See, throw keyword is used to throw the exception from try block to catch block, or else you can throw to the system handler also, right? So here, what is the syntax for throw? Throw followed by object. So here, instead of writing these two things, we can do one thing. What we need to do? We need to create an object for our class. What is our class? Sorry. What is our class? Invalid box exception. So our class name is space object is equal to, what is your object name? E. Or we can change that. So we can change the name of the object as obj. So new invalid box exception. So this exception, this constructor is expecting a string message. This constructor is expecting a string message. I'm passing that string message here. Then after creating the object, I'm just throwing that object. I'm throwing that object. How to throw the object? Throw space obj. Whatever the object you're creating, you're simply throwing that. So you're simply throwing that. What happens here? So here the exception will be created at that point and that will be thrown. So this is the usage of throw keyword. If it is a predefined exception, no need to throw that. But if it is a user-defined exception, you need to throw that. So actually it is a um, what we call unchecked exception. That's why these are all not mandatory. That means throw is mandatory. Of course, throw is mandatory. Why? Because it's a user-defined exception. You need to throw that. Uh, that's your wish whether to throw from try to catch or to the system handler. That's your wish. But if it is a checked exception, it's mandatory to handle that exception. So we will just change this. So how to create a checked exception by extending the properties of exception class. If you extend the properties of exception class, your class will become checked exception. Now what we will do, we will remove the try catch. So I'll remove the try catch. So I'm not writing try catch. I'm not writing throws keyword also. So what I need to get? I should get the compiler error. We'll see if I compile this. So I'm getting the error. So what is the error? I compiled and only we got the error. What is the error? Unreported exception, invalid box exception. Must be caught or declared to be thrown. Right? So it should be caught or it should be handled using try catch. Why? Because it is a checked exception. So previously we didn't get this error. We didn't get this error. Why? Because that is an unchecked exception. We have created an unchecked exception by extending runtime exception properties. But now you are extending the properties of exception class, which is a checked exception. If it is a checked exception, you need to handle that using try catch or you need to throw that using throws keyword. Now we will follow any of those two things. Simply we will write throws. So this method throws an invalid box exception, throws invalid box exception. Now if I try to compile this, okay, so we are getting the exception here. So there also we need to throw that. Why? Because so here in this method you may get the exception. But while creating also you may get the exception, right? That's why we have written try catch here. That means in this main method also throws, we may get the invalid exception. So this method also should throw that using throws keyword. So I'm saving this. Now if I try to compile this program, I'm getting no errors. So previously we got the errors. Why? Because we didn't throw it or we didn't handle it using try catch. And coming to execution, it's a normal fashion, same as the previous program. Same, an attempt is made to create an invalid box. So this is a system generated message. Why? Because you're simply throwing that, you're just simply informing to the system to handle that. Now you can handle the exception as it is a checked exception. You can simply throw that. You can inform the system to handle that. Otherwise, you can handle that using try catch also. So this is about user-defined exceptions and the usage of throw keyword in the user-defined exceptions. I hope everyone is clear with this video. Thank you.